The western desert of North Africa in 1941 was a landscape of extremes, a vast expanse of sand, rock, and scrub, stretching from the Mediterranean coast deep into the Sahara, where two armies fought for control of a seemingly worthless wasteland that held the key to the Middle East and its oil. The desert was a place of brutal heat during the day and bitter cold at night, of blinding sandstorms that could last for days, of mirages that made distant objects appear close and close objects disappear entirely. It was terrain unlike anything European soldiers had experienced, a place where traditional military tactics had to be adapted or abandoned, where water was more precious than ammunition, and where the ability to navigate by sun and stars could mean the difference between life and death. Into this unforgiving environment came two armies, the British 8th Army defending Egypt and the Suez Canal, and the German Africa Corps, under the command of General Erwin Rommel, sent to rescue Italy's failing North African campaign and to threaten British control of the Middle East. Rommel arrived in North Africa in February 1941, with a reputation as a bold and innovative commander, earned during the invasion of France in 1940. He quickly proved that his reputation was deserved. Within weeks of his arrival, he launched an offensive that drove British forces back across Libya, recapturing territory the Italians had lost and threatening the vital port of Tobruk. Rommel's tactics were aggressive and unconventional. He used speed and surprise to keep his opponents off balance, personally led reconnaissance missions to gather intelligence, and made decisions rapidly based on incomplete information rather than waiting for perfect knowledge. His willingness to take risks and his ability to exploit opportunities made him a formidable opponent. British soldiers began to speak of him with a mixture of fear and respect, calling him the Desert Fox for his cunning and his ability to appear where he was least expected. The nickname spread through the ranks and eventually reached the British press, which romanticized Rommel as a chivalrous enemy, a worthy adversary fighting a clean war in the desert, far from the atrocities being committed elsewhere. The reality was more complex. Rommel was indeed a skilled commander, but he was also serving a regime that was committing genocide in Europe, and his victories in North Africa were intended to support Hitler's broader strategic goals. The war in the desert was not as clean as the British press suggested. Prisoners were sometimes mistreated, supply lines were attacked, and the civilian populations of Libya and Egypt suffered under occupation and military operations. But the Desert War did have certain characteristics that distinguished it from other theaters: the absence of large civilian populations in the combat zones, the focus on mobile warfare rather than static trench lines, and the mutual respect that sometimes developed between opponents who faced the same harsh environment. Rommel himself cultivated an image as a professional soldier who fought by the rules, and to some extent, this image was accurate. He generally treated prisoners well. He did not participate in the Holocaust or other Nazi atrocities, and he focused on military objectives rather than ideological goals. But he was still fighting for Nazi Germany, and his successes in North Africa prolonged the war and cost Allied lives. By mid-1941, Rommel had established himself as the dominant force in the Western Desert. His Africa Corps, though small compared to the armies fighting on the Eastern Front, was highly effective, combining German mechanized units with Italian infantry divisions to create a mobile force capable of rapid advances and sudden attacks. Rommel's greatest strength was his use of armor. He understood how to concentrate tanks at decisive points, how to coordinate armor with infantry and artillery, and how to use the desert terrain to conceal his movements and surprise his enemies. British commanders struggled to counter his tactics. They had more tanks than Rommel, but they often dispersed them across the battlefield rather than concentrating them for decisive strikes. They were cautious, where Rommel was bold, methodical, where he was improvisational. Time and again, Rommel outmaneuvered and outfought British forces that should have had the advantage in numbers and resources. The British needed new tactics, new strategies, and new ways of thinking if they were going to defeat the Desert Fox. One of the key challenges facing British forces was the difficulty of gathering accurate intelligence about Rommel's movements and intentions. The desert was vast, and visibility was often poor due to heat haze, dust, and sandstorms. Reconnaissance aircraft could provide some information, but they could be deceived by camouflage and dummy positions. Ground reconnaissance was dangerous and time-consuming. Radio intercepts provided valuable intelligence, but they had to be carefully analyzed and could be misleading if the Germans were practicing radio deception. The British needed better ways to understand what Rommel was doing, where his tanks were positioned, where he planned to attack, what his supply situation was. Without accurate intelligence, British commanders were constantly reacting to Rommel's moves rather than anticipating them, always one step behind the Desert Fox. The solution to this problem would come not from generals or intelligence officers, but from ordinary soldiers who understood the desert and who were willing to use unconventional methods to deceive and confuse the enemy. Among the thousands of British soldiers fighting in the Western Desert was a sergeant named Jasper Maskelyne, though the story that would later be told about him was largely fictional. The real deception operations in North Africa were carried out by many individuals and units, including camouflage experts, engineers, and intelligence officers, working together to create elaborate schemes to mislead Rommel about British strength, positions, and intentions. These deception operations became increasingly sophisticated as the war progressed, evolving from simple camouflage to complex strategic deceptions, involving fake tanks, dummy supply dumps, false radio traffic, and carefully planted misinformation. The goal was to make Rommel see what the British wanted him to see, to make weak positions appear strong, strong positions appear weak, and to draw German attacks toward prepared defenses while concealing the locations of actual British forces. The techniques developed in North Africa would later be used in other theaters, including the elaborate deception operations that helped ensure the success of D-Day. But in 1941, these techniques were still being developed, often through trial and error, by soldiers who had to improvise solutions to immediate tactical problems. One particular aspect of desert warfare that offered opportunities for deception was the way shadows appeared in aerial reconnaissance photographs. In the harsh sunlight of the desert, objects cast sharp, dark shadows that were clearly visible from the air. Tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces could be identified not only by their shapes, but by their shadows. Reconnaissance pilots and photo interpreters learned to look for these shadows as indicators of enemy positions. A concentration of tank-shaped shadows indicated an armored formation. The absence of shadows in an area suggested it was empty, This reliance on shadows for intelligence created a vulnerability that could be exploited. If you could create fake shadows, you could create fake tanks. If you could eliminate real shadows, you could make real tanks invisible. The challenge was to do this convincingly enough to fool experienced photo interpreters who were looking specifically for signs of deception. It required understanding how light and shadow worked in the desert, how they appeared from the air, and how to replicate them using simple materials that were available in a combat zone. This was the challenge that British camouflage units took on, and their solutions would play a significant role in deceiving Rommel and his intelligence officers. The British Army's interest in camouflage and deception had grown significantly since the beginning of the war, driven by painful lessons learned in France and during the early campaigns in North Africa. Traditional military thinking had focused on firepower, maneuver, and logistics, but the experience of fighting against German forces had demonstrated the importance of concealment and deception. German aircraft dominated the skies in the early years of the war, and their reconnaissance flights provided detailed intelligence about British positions, movements, and strength. British commanders realized that they needed to hide their forces from aerial observation and, more ambitiously, to actively deceive the Germans about where those forces were located and what they intended to do. This led to the formation of specialized camouflage units, staffed by soldiers who had backgrounds in art, theater, engineering, and other fields that required creative thinking and technical skill. These units were tasked with developing and implementing camouflage and deception schemes that would confuse German intelligence and give British forces tactical and strategic advantages. The camouflage units faced unique challenges in the desert environment. In Europe, forests, buildings, and varied terrain provided natural concealment, and camouflage often involved blending military equipment into existing landscapes. But the desert offered little natural cover. It was mostly flat, open terrain where anything man-made stood out starkly against the sand and rock. Camouflage in the desert required different approaches. One method was to disguise military equipment as something innocuous. A tank could be made to look like a truck by covering it with a wooden and canvas frame, making it appear less threatening to aerial observers. Another method was to create dummy equipment that looked real from the air. Fake tanks made from wood and canvas that would draw enemy attention and possibly enemy fire away from real positions. A third method was to manipulate shadows, either by eliminating the shadows cast by real equipment or by creating fake shadows that suggested the presence of equipment that did not exist. All of these methods required careful attention to detail, understanding of how things appeared from the air, and constant adaptation as German photo interpreters became more sophisticated at detecting deception. The use of dummy tanks became one of the most important deception techniques in the Desert War. A dummy tank could be constructed from wood, canvas, and metal tubing in a matter of hours by a small team of soldiers. From the ground, these dummies were obviously fake. They had no weight, no mechanical components, no armor. But from the air, especially from the altitude at which reconnaissance aircraft operated, they could be quite convincing if properly constructed and positioned. The key was to replicate the visual signature of a real tank, the correct size and shape, the right color and texture, and most importantly, the correct shadow. A dummy tank without a shadow, or with a shadow that did not match the sun angle, would immediately be recognized as fake by a trained photo interpreter. But a dummy tank with a properly painted shadow, positioned correctly relative to the sun, could fool even experienced analysts, at least temporarily. The challenge was to create these shadows in a way that looked natural and that would remain convincing as the sun moved across the sky throughout the day. British camouflage officers experimented with various techniques for creating fake shadows. The simplest method was to paint a shadow directly onto the ground next to the dummy tank, using black or dark brown paint to create a shape that matched what a real shadow would look like. This worked reasonably well in aerial photographs taken at certain times of day, but it had obvious limitations. The painted shadow did not change position as the sun moved, so photographs taken at different times would show inconsistencies. A more sophisticated approach was to use dark fabric or netting stretched on the ground to create a shadow that had texture and depth. This looked more realistic than painted shadows, but it required more materials and more time to set up. Another approach was to construct the dummy tank on a slight platform or frame that would cast a real shadow, though this added complexity and made the dummy more difficult to transport and deploy. Each method had advantages and disadvantages, and camouflage units had to choose the approach that best fit their specific situation, the available materials, the time available for construction, the expected duration of the deception, and the sophistication of enemy reconnaissance. The effectiveness of dummy tanks and fake shadows depended not only on their construction, but on their deployment. A single dummy tank sitting alone in the desert would likely be recognized as suspicious, but a group of dummy tanks positioned as a real armored unit would be positioned with appropriate spacing, with some dummies positioned hull down behind terrain features, with fake vehicle tracks leading to and from the position, and with other indicators of military activity like dummy supply dumps and fake radio traffic. This could create a convincing picture of a real armored formation. The deception had to tell a coherent story that fit with what German intelligence expected to see. If the British were known to have 3 armored divisions in North Africa, and German reconnaissance could locate only 2 of them, the Germans would be looking for the 3rd division. A well-constructed dummy position could convince them they had found it, causing them to misallocate their forces or to attack a position that was actually empty, while the real British armor struck elsewhere. By late 1941, British camouflage and deception operations in North Africa had become increasingly sophisticated and increasingly integrated into operational planning. Deception was no longer an afterthought or a minor tactical consideration. It was a key element of strategy. Major operations were planned with deception components from the beginning, with camouflage units working alongside intelligence officers and operational planners to create comprehensive schemes that would mislead Rommel about British intentions. These schemes often involved multiple layers of deception: tactical deceptions to conceal the positions of specific units, operational deceptions to mislead the enemy about the timing and location of attacks, and strategic deceptions to create false impressions about overall British strength and capabilities. The goal was to get inside Rommel's decision-making process, to feed him false information that would cause him to make mistakes, to draw his forces out of position or to hold them in place when they should be moving. It was a chess game played across hundreds of miles of desert, where the pieces were real soldiers and tanks, but where perception and deception were as important as actual military strength. The challenge for British deception planners was that Rommel was not an easy opponent to fool. He was experienced, intelligent, and suspicious. His intelligence officers were skilled at photo interpretation and at analyzing the various sources of information available to them. They knew that the British were attempting to deceive them, and they looked carefully for signs of deception in reconnaissance photographs and intelligence reports. A poorly executed deception could be worse than no deception at all. If the Germans recognized that a position was fake, they would know that the British were trying to mislead them, and they might correctly infer that the real British forces were somewhere else. Deception had to be good enough to withstand scrutiny, consistent enough to be believable, and subtle enough not to appear too obvious. It was a demanding art that required both technical skill and psychological insight, understanding not just how to create fake tanks and shadows, but how the enemy would interpret what they saw and what conclusions they would draw from it. Among the soldiers working on camouflage and deception in the Western Desert was a British sergeant whose name has been lost to history, or perhaps deliberately obscured in official records, that focused on officers and official units rather than individual enlisted men. What we know from fragmentary accounts and post-war memoirs is that this sergeant had been a set designer in civilian life, working in London theaters before the war, and that he brought to his military service an understanding of how visual illusions worked, and how audiences, or in this case, enemy photo interpreters, could be made to see what the designer wanted them to see. He understood that theater was fundamentally about creating believable illusions using limited resources, about making painted canvas look like stone walls, about using lighting and shadow to create depth and atmosphere. These same principles, he realized, could be applied to military deception. The desert was a stage, the reconnaissance aircraft were the audience, and the goal was to create a performance convincing enough that the audience would believe what they were seeing and act accordingly. The sergeant's particular insight concerned the problem of shadows in aerial reconnaissance photographs. He had observed that existing methods for creating fake shadows, painting them on the ground or using dark fabric, had significant limitations. Painted shadows did not change with the sun angle and often looked flat and artificial in photographs. Fabric shadows were better, but still did not perfectly replicate the appearance of real shadows, and they were difficult to maintain in the desert wind. The sergeant proposed a different approach, one that was both simpler and more effective. Instead of trying to create fake shadows for dummy tanks, he suggested creating real shadows using simple structures that would cast shadows of the correct size and shape. The structures themselves would be low profile and difficult to see from the air, but their shadows would be prominent and would look exactly like the shadows cast by real tanks, because they would be real shadows, cast by real objects, following the same physical laws that governed all shadows in the desert sun. The sergeant's method involved constructing low frameworks from wood or metal tubing, shaped to match the outline of a tank when viewed from directly above. These frameworks would be only a few inches high, just tall enough to cast a visible shadow in the low-angle sunlight of early morning or late afternoon, when reconnaissance flights typically occurred, and when shadows were longest and most distinct. The frameworks would be covered with dark fabric or painted dark to enhance the shadow they cast. When positioned on the desert floor, these frameworks would be nearly invisible from the air. They were too low and too flat to register as three-dimensional objects in aerial photographs. But their shadows would be clearly visible, appearing as dark shapes on the sand that matched the size and outline of tank shadows. To an observer looking at an aerial photograph, these shadows would suggest the presence of tanks, even though no actual tanks, or even convincing dummy tanks, were present. It was a deception that relied on the fundamental way that photo interpreters analyzed images. They looked for shadows as primary indicators of the presence of vehicles and equipment. The beauty of the sergeant's method was its simplicity and efficiency. A shadow casting framework could be constructed in less than an hour using minimal materials, a few pieces of wood or tubing, some wire or rope to hold the structure together, and dark fabric or paint. A small team could deploy dozens of these frameworks in a single night, creating the appearance of an entire armored regiment where none existed. The frameworks were lightweight and portable, easy to move and reposition as needed. They required no maintenance beyond occasional repairs to the fabric or frame. And most importantly, they created real shadows that changed position and length as the sun moved across the sky, exactly as real tank shadows would do. This made them far more convincing than painted shadows, and far more practical than elaborate dummy tanks that required significant resources to construct and deploy. The sergeant had found a way to create a highly effective deception using the simplest possible means, exploiting the physics of light and shadow rather than trying to replicate the appearance of actual tanks. The sergeant tested his shadow frameworks in a series of small-scale experiments, positioning them in areas where they would be photographed by British reconnaissance aircraft, and then examining the resulting photographs to see how convincing the deception appeared. The results were promising. The shadows were clearly visible in the photographs and did indeed resemble tank shadows. Photo interpreters who were not told about the experiment identified the shadows as probable tank positions. Encouraged by these results, the sergeant proposed a larger-scale test, creating a fake armored position using shadow frameworks and other deception techniques to see whether it would draw German attention and possibly German attacks. His superiors, initially skeptical of the unconventional approach, agreed to the test. They had little to lose. If the deception failed, it would waste some materials and labor, but would not compromise actual military operations. If it succeeded, it could provide a valuable new tool for misleading Rommel and his intelligence officers. The location chosen for the test was an area of desert several miles behind British front lines, in a position where an armored reserve unit might plausibly be held. The sergeant and his team spent several nights deploying shadow frameworks arranged in the dispersed pattern that British armored units typically used when in defensive positions. They created approximately 50 fake tank shadows, representing roughly a battalion-strength formation. They supplemented the shadow frameworks with other elements of deception: fake vehicle tracks, created by dragging chains or logs behind trucks, a few actual dummy tanks constructed from canvas and wood to add three-dimensional elements to the position, simulated slit trenches and foxholes, and even fake latrines positioned at appropriate distances from the supposed tank positions. They were careful to make the position look lived in and realistic, not too perfect or too obviously arranged. Real military positions had a certain organic disorder to them, with vehicles and equipment positioned for tactical reasons rather than aesthetic ones, and the deception had to replicate this realistic disorder, rather than creating an overly neat arrangement that would appear suspicious. Within days of the fake position being established, German reconnaissance aircraft photographed the area. The photographs were analyzed by German intelligence officers, who identified the position as a probable British armored formation. German intelligence reports began referring to a British tank battalion in that location, and German operational planning took this supposed battalion into account when assessing British strength and dispositions. The deception had worked. The shadow frameworks and supporting elements had created a convincing enough illusion that experienced German photo interpreters had accepted it as real. The sergeant's innovation had proven its value. But the real test would come when German forces acted on this false intelligence, when Rommel made decisions based on the belief that British tanks were positioned where in fact only shadows and wooden frameworks existed. The sergeant and his superiors waited to see whether the Desert Fox would take the bait, whether the fake shadows would influence real military operations, and whether a simple deception created with minimal resources could actually affect the outcome of battles in the North African desert. The success of the shadow framework experiment led to rapid expansion of the technique across British positions in the Western Desert. Camouflage units received instructions to construct and deploy shadow frameworks as part of comprehensive deception plans designed to mislead German intelligence about British strength and dispositions. The sergeant who had pioneered the technique found himself training other soldiers in the construction and deployment of the frameworks, teaching them the principles of shadow creation and the importance of attention to detail. Each framework had to be positioned correctly relative to the sun angle at the time when German reconnaissance flights typically occurred. Each fake position had to include supporting details that would make it convincing: vehicle tracks, supply dumps, defensive positions, all the elements that would be present at a real military position. The goal was not simply to create individual fake tanks, but to create entire fake units that would appear in German intelligence assessments, and that would influence German operational planning. By November 1941, British forces were preparing for a major offensive operation codenamed Crusader, intended to relieve the besieged garrison at Tobruk and to drive Rommel's forces back across Libya. The offensive would involve the largest concentration of British armor yet assembled in North Africa. Over 400 tanks organized into multiple armored brigades. The success of the operation depended on achieving surprise, on striking Rommel before he could concentrate his forces to meet the attack. Deception would play a crucial role in the plan. British deception planners developed a comprehensive scheme to mislead Rommel about the timing, location, and strength of the offensive. The scheme involved multiple elements: fake radio traffic suggesting that the offensive would not occur until late December, dummy supply dumps positioned in areas away from the actual assembly areas, and extensive use of shadow frameworks and dummy tanks to create fake armored formations in locations where Rommel would expect British reserves to be positioned. The deception plan for Operation Crusader was ambitious and complex, involving coordination among multiple units and careful timing to ensure that all elements of the deception were in place before the offensive began. Camouflage units worked around the clock to construct and deploy hundreds of shadow frameworks and dummy tanks. Real tanks moving into forward assembly areas were disguised as trucks, using canvas covers and wooden frames, making them appear less threatening and less numerous than they actually were. Fake armored formations were created in rear areas using shadow frameworks, suggesting that British armor was being held in reserve rather than concentrated for an offensive. Radio operators transmitted fake messages suggesting routine activities and defensive preparations rather than offensive intentions. The goal was to create a picture in German intelligence assessments that showed British forces as weaker, less prepared, and less aggressive than they actually were, encouraging Rommel to maintain his current dispositions rather than concentrating his forces to meet an expected attack. German reconnaissance aircraft photographed British positions throughout November, and German photo interpreters analyzed the images, attempting to determine British strength and intentions. They identified numerous tank concentrations, many of which were actually shadow frameworks and dummy tanks, rather than real armored units. They noted supply dumps and defensive positions, some real and some fake. They intercepted radio traffic that suggested the British were not preparing for immediate offensive operations. The cumulative effect of the deception was to create confusion and uncertainty in German intelligence assessments. Some German officers believed that the British were preparing for an offensive, but they disagreed about when and where it would occur. Others believed that British forces were too weak or too poorly positioned to launch a major attack. Rommel himself was uncertain. He recognized that the British might be attempting to deceive him, but he could not be sure which intelligence was accurate and which was deception. This uncertainty was exactly what British deception planners had hoped to achieve, not necessarily to make Rommel believe a specific false narrative, but to create enough doubt and confusion that he would not be able to respond effectively when the real offensive began. Operation Crusader began on November 18, 1941, with British armored forces advancing across the Libyan border toward Tobruk. The initial attacks achieved tactical surprise. German forces were not positioned to meet the offensive, and British armor was able to advance significant distances before encountering serious resistance. Rommel was caught off balance, uncertain about the size and objectives of the British attack. His intelligence had suggested that British armor was dispersed and held in reserve, but now he was facing concentrated armored attacks in multiple locations. He responded by attempting to concentrate his own armor to meet the threat, but his forces were scattered, and it took time to bring them together. The confusion created by British deception operations had given the British a crucial advantage in the opening phase of the battle. The shadow frameworks and dummy tanks had played their role. They had contributed to German uncertainty about British strength and dispositions, and that uncertainty had prevented Rommel from positioning his forces optimally to meet the British offensive. The battle that followed was fierce and confused, with armored engagements occurring across a wide area of desert as both sides maneuvered for advantage. British forces initially made good progress, advancing toward Tobruk and threatening to cut off German forces in the area. But Rommel proved as resourceful in defense as he had been in attack. He concentrated his armor and launched counterattacks that inflicted heavy losses on British armored units. The battle swayed back and forth, with neither side able to achieve a decisive advantage. British commanders made tactical errors, dispersing their armor when they should have concentrated it, failing to coordinate infantry and armor effectively, and sometimes advancing too aggressively without adequate support. German forces fought skillfully, using superior tactics and better coordination between tanks, anti-tank guns, and artillery to inflict disproportionate losses on British armor. The battle became a grinding attrition struggle, with both sides suffering heavy casualties and neither able to achieve their objectives completely. Despite the tactical setbacks and heavy losses, Operation Crusader ultimately achieved its strategic objective: the relief of Tobruk and the temporary expulsion of German forces from eastern Libya. Rommel was forced to withdraw, his forces weakened by the sustained battle and threatened with being cut off from their supply lines. The British had paid a high price in tanks and casualties, but they had demonstrated that Rommel could be beaten, that the Desert Fox was not invincible. The deception operations that had preceded the offensive had contributed to this success by creating confusion and uncertainty that prevented Rommel from positioning his forces optimally. The shadow frameworks and dummy tanks had played a small but significant role in a large and complex operation. They had helped to create the conditions for tactical surprise, and tactical surprise had given British forces the initial advantage that allowed them to launch their offensive successfully. The sergeant who had pioneered the shadow framework technique could take satisfaction in knowing that his innovation had contributed to a significant British victory, even if his name would never appear in the official histories of the campaign. The success of Operation Crusader and the role that deception had played in achieving tactical surprise led to increased interest in camouflage and deception techniques throughout the British Army in North Africa. Senior commanders, who had previously been skeptical of deception, now recognized its value and demanded more extensive deception operations to support future offensives. The camouflage units that had been small and somewhat marginalized organizations suddenly found themselves with increased resources, more personnel, and direct access to operational planners. The shadow framework technique in particular attracted attention because it was simple, effective, and could be deployed rapidly with minimal resources. But as the technique was used more extensively, both its strengths and its limitations became apparent. German photo interpreters were becoming more sophisticated at detecting deception, and techniques that had worked in November might not work as well in subsequent operations. The camouflage units needed to refine and improve their methods, staying ahead of German countermeasures, and finding new ways to create convincing deceptions. The sergeant and other camouflage specialists began to study the science of shadows more systematically, attempting to understand exactly what made a shadow appear realistic in an aerial photograph, and what characteristics might reveal a shadow as fake. They examined hundreds of reconnaissance photographs, comparing real tank shadows with the shadows cast by their frameworks, looking for differences that might be detected by trained photo interpreters. They discovered that shadows were more complex than they had initially realized. A real shadow cast by a three-dimensional object, like a tank, was not uniformly dark. It had gradations of darkness, with the darkest areas directly beneath the object and lighter areas at the edges, where scattered light from the sky and reflected light from the surrounding sand partially illuminated the shadowed area. The shadows cast by their low frameworks were more uniformly dark, lacking these subtle gradations. This difference was not obvious in all photographs, but in high-quality images taken under optimal conditions, it could potentially be detected by a careful analyst. To address this limitation, the camouflage specialists experimented with ways to create more realistic shadow gradations. One approach was to construct frameworks of varying heights, with the highest parts in the center and lower parts at the edges, creating shadows that were darkest in the middle and lighter at the periphery. Another approach was to use materials of different opacity, solid materials in the center of the framework, and more transparent netting or fabric at the edges, to create shadows with varying darkness. A third approach was to position the frameworks on slightly uneven ground, so that the shadow would naturally have variations in darkness due to the contours of the terrain. Each of these methods added complexity to the construction and deployment of the frameworks, but they also made the resulting shadows more realistic and harder to distinguish from real tank shadows. The goal was to create deceptions that would withstand increasingly sophisticated analysis, that would remain convincing even as German photo interpreters became more experienced at detecting British deception techniques. Another challenge that emerged was the problem of shadow direction and length. Shadows change throughout the day as the sun moves across the sky, and a shadow that looks correct in a photograph taken at 9 in the morning will look wrong in a photograph taken at 3 in the afternoon. German reconnaissance flights did not occur at predictable times. They varied depending on weather, operational requirements, and the availability of aircraft. A deception that was optimized for morning shadows might be revealed as fake if photographed in the afternoon, when the shadows would be pointing in a different direction. The camouflage specialists realized that they needed to design their shadow frameworks to create convincing shadows across a range of sun angles, not just at one specific time of day. This was a significant challenge because the shape of a shadow changes as the sun angle changes. A tank photographed in early morning casts a long shadow extending to one side, while the same tank photographed at midday casts a much shorter shadow directly beneath it. The solution to the shadow direction problem required understanding the geometry of how shadows were cast and how they appeared in aerial photographs. The camouflage specialists worked with mathematicians and surveyors to calculate shadow lengths and directions for different times of day and different seasons, creating tables and diagrams that showed how shadows should appear under various conditions. They designed their frameworks to create shadows that would look plausible across a range of sun angles, accepting that the shadows might not be perfect for any specific time, but would be good enough to avoid detection across the range of times when reconnaissance flights might occur. They also began to position their frameworks more carefully, taking into account the typical times of German reconnaissance flights and orienting the frameworks to create optimal shadows during those times. This required intelligence about German flight patterns and careful observation of when reconnaissance aircraft appeared over British positions. It was another example of how deception operations required integration of multiple types of information, not just technical knowledge about how to create fake shadows, but intelligence about enemy reconnaissance patterns and operational understanding of when deception would be most valuable. As winter turned to spring in 1942, the war in North Africa entered a new phase. Rommel had withdrawn to defensive positions after Operation Crusader, but he was preparing for a new offensive, building up supplies and reinforcements for an attack that would drive British forces back toward Egypt. British forces, exhausted by the Crusader offensive and weakened by the transfer of units to other theaters, were attempting to consolidate their positions and prepare for the expected German attack. Both sides were engaged in extensive reconnaissance and intelligence gathering, each trying to determine the other's strength, positions, and intentions. In this environment, deception became even more important. British commanders needed to conceal their weaknesses and create the impression of strength in areas where they were actually vulnerable. German commanders needed to identify British positions and strength to plan their offensive effectively. The shadow frameworks and other deception techniques were deployed extensively, creating fake armored formations and supply dumps that appeared in German intelligence assessments and that influenced German planning. The deception was no longer experimental. It was an integral part of military operations, as important as reconnaissance, logistics, and tactical planning. The sergeant who had pioneered the shadow framework technique was promoted to warrant officer in recognition of his contributions to deception operations. He continued to work on refining and improving the technique, training new personnel, and developing new variations that could be used in different tactical situations. He had become something of a specialist in the science of shadows, understanding not just how to create them, but how they were perceived, how they could be analyzed, and how deception could be detected and countered. He understood that deception was an ongoing competition between deceivers and analysts, with each side constantly adapting to the other's methods. A deception technique that worked today might be ineffective tomorrow if the enemy learned to recognize it. The key to successful deception was not to rely on any single technique, but to constantly innovate, to surprise the enemy with new methods, and to combine multiple deception techniques in ways that reinforced each other and created a coherent and convincing false picture. The shadow frameworks were one tool among many, valuable not because they were perfect, but because they were simple, flexible, and could be adapted to many different situations. They were a testament to the principle that effective deception did not require elaborate technology or massive resources. It required understanding of how perception worked and creativity in exploiting that understanding. By late spring of 1942, both British and German forces in North Africa had rebuilt their strength after the battles of the previous months. The British Eighth Army held a defensive line running south from the coastal town of Gazala, a position fortified with minefields, defensive boxes held by infantry brigades, and armored reserves positioned to counterattack any German breakthrough. British commanders were confident in their positions. They had numerical superiority in tanks. Their defensive line was strong, and their intelligence suggested that any German attack would come directly against the fortified positions where British firepower could inflict maximum casualties. To reinforce this belief and to deter a German attack, British deception planners created extensive fake positions behind the Gazala line, using shadow frameworks and dummy tanks to suggest that British armored reserves were larger and more concentrated than they actually were. The goal was to make Rommel believe that an attack on the Gazala line would be too costly, that British defenses were too strong to be broken by the forces he had available. But Rommel was not deterred by the apparent British strength, and he was not planning the kind of direct frontal assault that British commanders expected. Instead, he planned a bold flanking maneuver, sending his armored forces on a wide sweep around the southern end of the British defensive line, bypassing the fortified positions and striking at the British rear areas and supply lines. It was a risky plan that required his armor to drive deep into British-held territory, exposing his forces to counterattack and potentially cutting them off from their own supply lines. But Rommel believed that the British would not react quickly enough to stop him, that he could achieve surprise and create chaos in the British rear, before British armored reserves could be concentrated to meet his attack. He was gambling that British commanders would be confused by his unexpected maneuver and would make mistakes in their response. It was the kind of aggressive, unconventional operation that had made Rommel famous, and it was exactly the kind of operation that deception could not easily prevent. The German offensive began on May 26, 1942, with Rommel's armor sweeping around the southern flank of the Gazala line as planned. British commanders were indeed surprised by the maneuver. Their intelligence had not detected the concentration of German armor in the south, and they had not expected Rommel to attempt such a risky flanking movement. The extensive deception operations that had created fake British armored reserves had not deterred Rommel. He had either not believed the intelligence about British strength, or he had decided to attack despite it. The shadow frameworks and dummy tanks that had been deployed to create the impression of powerful British reserves had failed to achieve their strategic objective. Rommel had not been deceived about British intentions, and he had not been deterred from attacking. The deception had not failed technically. German reconnaissance had photographed the fake positions, and German intelligence had reported them as real British units. But the deception had failed strategically because Rommel had chosen to attack anyway, and he had chosen a method of attack that bypassed the areas where the fake reserves were supposedly positioned. The Battle of Gazala quickly became a confused and desperate struggle, as British commanders attempted to respond to Rommel's flanking maneuver. British armored brigades were sent forward piecemeal to counterattack the German advance, but they were defeated in detail by superior German tactics and coordination. Rommel's forces drove deep into British rear areas, capturing supply dumps and threatening to cut off the entire Gazala line. British commanders made a series of tactical errors, failing to concentrate their armor effectively, attacking without adequate reconnaissance or coordination, and sometimes holding back reserves when they should have been committed to battle. The Germans exploited these mistakes ruthlessly, using their superior tactical skill and better coordination between tanks, anti-tank guns, and artillery to inflict devastating losses on British armor. Within days, the British position at Gazala had collapsed, and British forces were retreating in disorder toward the Egyptian border. It was one of the worst British defeats of the North African campaign, and it demonstrated the limits of what deception could achieve. The failure of deception to prevent the Gazala disaster led to serious questions about the value and limitations of camouflage and deception operations. Some officers argued that too much effort and too many resources had been devoted to deception, resources that could have been better used for actual military preparations. They pointed out that the elaborate fake positions and dummy tanks had not prevented Rommel from attacking and had not influenced the outcome of the battle. Others argued that the deception had actually been counterproductive, creating false confidence among British commanders who believed their positions were stronger than they actually were. The sergeant and other deception specialists found themselves defending their work, explaining that deception could not compensate for poor tactical decisions or for fundamental weaknesses in British armored tactics and doctrine. Deception could create opportunities and could mislead the enemy about strength and intentions, but it could not win battles by itself. It was a supporting element of military operations, not a substitute for sound strategy, effective tactics, and well-trained forces. The post-battle analysis of the Gazala defeat revealed important lessons about both the strengths and limitations of deception. The deception operations had succeeded in their immediate technical objectives. German intelligence had identified the fake British positions as real, and German reconnaissance photographs had shown the shadow frameworks and dummy tanks as apparent evidence of British armored strength. But the deception had failed to achieve its strategic objective because Rommel had not responded to the deception in the way that British planners had expected. He had not been deterred from attacking, and he had not attacked where the British expected him to attack. This highlighted a fundamental challenge in deception operations. The deceiver could control what false information was presented to the enemy, but could not control how the enemy interpreted that information or how the enemy chose to act on it. Rommel had seen the intelligence about British armored reserves, but he had either not believed it, or he had decided that his flanking maneuver would avoid those reserves, or he had simply been willing to accept the risk of attacking against superior forces. Whatever his reasoning, the deception had not influenced his decision-making in the way that British planners had intended. Despite the failure at Gazala, deception operations continued and even expanded in the months that followed. British commanders recognized that the problem at Gazala had not been with deception itself, but with unrealistic expectations about what deception could achieve, and with failure to integrate deception properly into overall operational planning. Deception could not replace military strength or compensate for poor tactics, but it could create opportunities and could complicate enemy planning and decision-making. The key was to use deception as part of a comprehensive approach that combined real military capabilities with false information designed to mislead the enemy about where and how those capabilities would be employed. The shadow frameworks and dummy tanks remained valuable tools, but they needed to be used more carefully and more strategically as part of deception plans that were realistic about what could be achieved and that were integrated into operations from the beginning, rather than added as afterthoughts. The sergeant and his colleagues took these lessons to heart as they prepared for the next phase of the North African campaign, knowing that Rommel was now advancing toward Egypt and that British forces would need every advantage, including deception, to stop him. By autumn of 1942, the war in North Africa had reached a critical juncture. Rommel's forces had advanced deep into Egypt following their victory at Gazala, reaching a position near the small railway station of El Alamein, only 60 miles from Alexandria and the Suez Canal. But the advance had exhausted German and Italian forces, stretching their supply lines to the breaking point and depleting their strength in men, tanks, and fuel. The British Eighth Army now under new command with General Bernard Montgomery as its leader, had established a strong defensive position at El Alamein, where the narrow gap between the Mediterranean coast and the impassable Qattara Depression prevented Rommel from attempting another flanking maneuver. Here, finally, the two armies would meet in a direct confrontation, and here, the accumulated lessons of 2 years of desert warfare, including the hard-learned lessons about deception, would be put to their ultimate test. Montgomery was a methodical commander who believed in careful planning, overwhelming superiority in men and materials, and thorough preparation before launching any offensive. He was also a strong believer in deception, understanding that even with superior forces, achieving surprise could reduce casualties and increase the chances of decisive victory. For the offensive at El Alamein, codenamed Operation Lightfoot, Montgomery and his staff developed the most comprehensive deception plan yet attempted in the North African campaign. The plan, called Operation Bertram, involved multiple elements designed to mislead Rommel about the timing, location, and nature of the British attack. The goal was to make Rommel believe that the main British attack would come in the south, against the weakest part of his line, when in fact, the main attack would come in the north. And the goal was to make him believe that the attack would not come until November, when in fact, it would be launched in late October. The sergeant, now a warrant officer with extensive experience in deception operations, was assigned a crucial role in Operation Bertram. His task was to create a fake armored concentration in the southern sector, suggesting that British armor was being assembled for an attack in that area. But this time, the deception had to be more sophisticated than anything attempted before. German photo interpreters had become skilled at detecting British deception techniques. They knew about dummy tanks and shadow frameworks, and they looked carefully for signs that positions were fake. The deception at El Alamein would need to be layered and complex, combining multiple techniques in ways that would be mutually reinforcing and that would withstand careful scrutiny. It would need to show not just fake tanks, but the entire infrastructure of a real armored concentration: supply dumps, command posts, vehicle maintenance areas, communications facilities, all the elements that would be present if British armor were actually being assembled for an offensive. The sergeant and his teams worked for weeks to create the fake armored concentration. They used shadow frameworks, but they positioned them more carefully than ever before, taking into account the exact sun angles at the times when German reconnaissance flights typically occurred. They varied the sizes and shapes of the frameworks to represent different types of vehicles: tanks, armored cars, supply trucks, command vehicles. They created fake vehicle tracks leading to and from the positions, using specially designed rollers pulled behind trucks to create realistic-looking tracks in the sand. They constructed dummy supply dumps using empty fuel cans and ammunition boxes, arranged to look like full dumps when photographed from the air. They even created fake slit trenches and foxholes, positioned where soldiers would dig them if they were actually manning the position. And crucially, they made the fake position appear to develop gradually over time, adding new elements day by day, exactly as a real concentration would develop as units moved into position and supplies were accumulated. But the most innovative element of the deception was the treatment of the real armored concentration in the northern sector. Montgomery's plan called for hundreds of tanks to be moved into forward positions in the north, ready to launch the main attack. These tanks could not be hidden. German reconnaissance would inevitably photograph them. But they could be disguised. The sergeant and his colleagues developed special covers for the tanks, wooden and canvas structures that made them look like ordinary supply trucks when viewed from the air. The covers were carefully designed to match the size and shape of standard British trucks, and they were painted and weathered to look realistic. Tanks fitted with these covers and photographed from reconnaissance altitude looked like trucks, non-threatening logistics vehicles rather than combat armor. As the tanks moved into forward positions, they appeared to German intelligence as a routine buildup of supplies, not as an armored concentration preparing for attack. Meanwhile, in the southern sector, the fake armored concentration created with shadow frameworks and dummy tanks suggested that British armor was being assembled there, drawing German attention away from the real concentration in the north. The deception was supported by elaborate radio deception, with fake radio traffic suggesting that the armored units supposedly in the south were conducting training and preparation for an offensive. Engineers constructed a fake water pipeline in the southern sector, building it slowly and deliberately to suggest that the British were preparing infrastructure for an offensive, but that the offensive would not be ready until the pipeline was completed in November. Every element of the deception was designed to tell a consistent story, that British forces were preparing for an attack in the south, and that the attack would not come until late November at the earliest. It was a story that German intelligence wanted to believe because it suggested that they had time to prepare and that they could predict where the British would attack, and because it was a story supported by multiple sources of intelligence: aerial reconnaissance, radio intercepts, agent reports, and captured documents. It was a story that German commanders found credible. On the night of October 23, 1942, Operation Lightfoot began with a massive artillery barrage in the northern sector, followed by infantry and armor advancing to break through German defenses. Rommel was not present. He had returned to Germany on sick leave, confident that no British attack was imminent. The German forces at El Alamein were caught by surprise, not by the fact of the attack, but by its timing and location. They had expected an attack in the south in November, and instead they faced an attack in the north in October. Their reserves were positioned to meet an attack in the south and had to be redeployed under fire to meet the actual attack in the north. The confusion and delay caused by the deception gave British forces crucial hours to establish their breakthrough and to push through the German defensive positions. The battle that followed was fierce and costly, lasting 12 days and involving some of the heaviest fighting of the North African campaign. But British forces, with their superiority in numbers and their advantage of surprise, gradually wore down German resistance and forced Rommel, who had rushed back from Germany, to order a retreat. The victory at El Alamein was a turning point in the North African campaign and in the wider war. It was the first major British victory over German forces, and it marked the beginning of a long retreat that would eventually drive Axis forces out of North Africa entirely. Churchill famously said that before Alamein, Britain had never had a victory, and after Alamein, Britain never had a defeat. The victory was achieved through many factors: superior numbers, better logistics, improved tactics, effective leadership, and the courage and determination of British and Commonwealth soldiers. But deception had played its role, creating the conditions for tactical surprise and forcing German commanders to make decisions based on false information. The shadow frameworks and dummy tanks, the disguised real tanks, the fake supply dumps and water pipeline, all the elements of Operation Bertram had contributed to the confusion and delay that gave British forces their crucial initial advantage. In the aftermath of the battle, the sergeant walked through the fake armored concentration in the southern sector, examining the shadow frameworks and dummy tanks that had helped to deceive Rommel. The frameworks looked crude and obvious now, seen from ground level in the harsh light of day. Simple wooden structures covered with dark fabric, nothing like real tanks. But from 3,000 feet up, photographed through the lens of a reconnaissance camera, they had cast shadows that looked real enough to fool experienced German photo interpreters. They had been part of a larger deception, one element in a complex plan, but they had played their part. The sergeant thought about the journey that had brought him here, from a London theater where he had painted scenery and created stage illusions, to the North African desert, where he had created illusions of a different kind, illusions that had influenced real battles and saved real lives. He thought about the fundamental principle that connected theater and military deception. That perception was reality, that what people believed they saw was more important than what was actually there, and that a convincing illusion created with simple means could be more effective than an elaborate construction that looked artificial. The war would continue for more than 2 years after El Alamein, and deception would play increasingly important roles in Allied operations, from the invasion of Sicily to the Normandy landings, where elaborate deception plans would help to achieve strategic surprise on an even larger scale. The techniques pioneered in the North African desert, including the shadow frameworks and the methods for creating realistic fake positions, would be refined and expanded, becoming part of the standard toolkit of Allied deception operations. But for the sergeant and the other soldiers who had worked on deception in North Africa, El Alamein represented the culmination of their efforts, the moment when all the lessons learned through experiment and failure had come together in a deception plan that had worked exactly as intended. They had created shadows in the desert, shadows that had deceived the desert fox himself, and those shadows had helped to change the course of the war. Years later, long after the war had ended and the sergeant had returned to civilian life, he would sometimes think about those shadows in the desert. He would remember the simple wooden frameworks, the careful calculations of sun angles, the nights spent positioning the frameworks in the sand, and the satisfaction of seeing reconnaissance photographs that showed his fake shadows looking exactly like real tank shadows. He would remember that in war, as in theater, the most effective illusions were often the simplest ones, the ones that worked with natural forces rather than against them, the ones that showed the audience exactly what they expected to see. And he would remember that sometimes, in the right circumstances, a shadow could be as powerful as the object that cast it, that an absence could be as significant as a presence, and that the art of deception was ultimately the art of understanding how people see and what they believe. The shadows had been real, even if the tanks were not, and in the end, that had been enough.